So today we're going to talk about negative exponents. The problem with doing this first is you're not going to understand why the rule is what it is until we actually do the quotient rule. So you're just going to have to trust me with my rule and know that in a week or two when we get to the quotient rule, you'll know exactly why we do what we do. So the directions here say to write with positive exponents. This is super simple. If you notice, we have a negative exponent, which means we're automatically going to draw a fraction bar. We also know, since there's no line here, this is technically over 1. To make a negative exponent positive, you move it to the opposite side of the fraction bar. So in this case, we have the negative exponent up top. To make it positive, we're going to move the exponent and what it's attached to the bottom. We can't just have a denominator with no numerator, so we use 1 as a placeholder. And that is your answer. For this one, we automatically have a negative exponent. Set up your fraction bar. The negative exponent is on the bottom, so in order to make something negative on the bottom turn positive, we have to move it up to the top. Take the base that it's attached to, bump it to the top. Now in this case, you are allowed to have a numerator without a denominator, so that is your answer. For this one, we have a negative exponent. Draw your fraction bar. Technically, we know this is up top, so to make it positive, we have to move it to the bottom. And the exponent turns positive. We can't just have this floating on the bottom, so we use 1 as a placeholder up top. Now in this case, if you notice, we have variables. One of the variables has a negative exponent, the x has a positive exponent. So since you see this negative exponent, you automatically set up your fraction bar. We know this is technically on top of a fraction. So in order to make r to the negative 4 r to the 4th, we have to move it to the bottom. Now x to the 5th is already positive, so we leave it where it is. It stays up top. So remember, think of this as two separate entities. The negative 4 goes with the r, the 5 goes with the x. You can move them separately. And this last guy, we have negative exponents, so automatically set up your fraction bar. We know technically that's a fraction over 1. We have a negative exponent attached to the x. To make that positive, move it to the opposite side of the fraction. To make y to the negative 7th positive, since it's on top, we move it to the bottom. We can't have this floating by itself, so put a placeholder for the 1. So now, it wants us to write with negative exponents. This is really nice and simple. In order to make a positive exponent negative, you literally move it to the other side of the fraction and then make it negative. So this is on bottom, so it's moving to the top, and when you move it, it turns to the opposite sign, so you get negative 34. Now remember, if you had a placeholder, it would just be a 1, and we know anything divided by 1 is itself, which is why we know that that's just the answer and I don't need the 1. In fact, I think if you put a 1 into IXL, it's going to mark it wrong, so don't do that. Next up, if we wanted to make this negative, since it's on the bottom, we have to move it to the top, and moving it changes the sign. So there's your answer for that one. Try these two guys on your own. All right, for this one, you should have gotten 9 to the negative 17th. and this one x to the negative 3. So now we're just taking it a step farther, and we're working with only variables, and we only want positive exponents. So really, really simple. Remember, if you see a negative exponent, make your fraction bar. Ooh. We already have a positive exponent for this first one, so that's going to stay where it is, and it's on top. Since x to the negative 3 is a negative exponent, we need to move it to the opposite side to make it positive, so it becomes x to the 3rd. And that's your answer. I have negative exponents, so draw your fraction bar. X to the negative 10 is technically on top. To make it positive, you have to move it to the bottom. Y to the negative 11 is technically on top. To make it positive, move to the bottom. Obviously, change your signs. Can't have this floating by itself, so put a 1 as a placeholder. This guy, we have a negative exponent. At this point, x to the 5th, you should know, is on top and positive, so it's going to stay on top. To force this one to become positive, we have to move it to the bottom, change the sign. This one, we have 2 positive exponents, so guess what? That's your answer. If you move them, they'll become negative, and we don't want that because we only want positive. And if we have this guy, we have a negative exponent, so make your fraction bar. To make your negative exponent on the bottom turn positive, you have to move it to the top, change your sign. Y to the 5th is already positive, and since it's on the bottom, it stays on the bottom. We're going to do the top 2 together. You're going to try the bottom 3 on your own. 2 negative exponents. Make your fraction bar. This negative 2 is attached to the x. To force the exponent to become positive, you have to move it to the opposite side. If it's on the bottom, the opposite is the top, and you turn it positive. Y to the negative 5th, to force it to become positive, you have to move it to the other side of the fraction and turn it positive. Remember, technically there's a 1 here, but we don't need it, so this is just your answer. And last but not least, for my sake on this board, negative exponent, draw your fraction bar. X to the 6th is positive. We like that because we only want positive vibes in our life. So it stays where it is, which happens to be on the bottom. Number Y is negative. We don't want negative people in our life, so we want to move it to the opposite side of the fraction bar so we don't have to look at it anymore. And he turns positive because he's like, oh my gosh, I'm all alone. I need to check myself. And this is your answer. Try those on your own. So I'm just going to explain these quick. Negative exponents, fraction bar. These are both on top and both negative. So they both have to go to the bottom and change your sign. You need a 1 for a placeholder. This one, the y to the 4th is positive, so it stays where it is, which is on top. To force the x to the negative 5th to become positive, you move it to the opposite side of the fraction bar and change the sign. And this guy, negative exponent, so you draw your fraction bar. X to the negative 2 is negative. To force him to be positive, move him up top, change the sign. Y squared is already positive, so leave it where it is on the bottom. All right, Last board, I promise. So this I just wanted to go over because it's on IXL and I just don't want it to confuse you. It says write your answer, that should say as a fraction or a whole number. So basically, this is saying you have the fraction 1/9 and you're raising it to the negative second power. So this negative, as you know, flips the fraction. So 1/9, when it's raised to a negative, becomes 9/1, and your exponent is now positive. You know 9 divided by 1 is 9. And you should have known that you do what's in your parentheses first because of order of operations. We know 9 squared is the same thing as 9 times 9, which is 81. Now we have 1/4 to the negative fourth. So again, the negative in this flips your fraction. And since you flipped it, this now turns positive. Using order of operations, you know you do what's in parentheses first. 4 divided by 1 is 4. 4 to the fourth is 4 times 4 times 4 times 4, which I think is 256. But I'm going to check that. Yep, it's 256. So that's your answer. This guy, again, negative exponent. Flip your fraction, which turns your exponent to a positive. 3 divided by 1 is 3. 3 to the fifth is not 15. It's 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, which is 243. And you do this one on your own, and you should get 64. Now this one is kind of like the reverse. You have 2 to the negative 3 to force it to become positive. Again, you move it to the bottom. But this time they want you to actually give the actual answer, evaluate it. So we know 2 to the third is the same thing as 2 times 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. So it's 1/8. In this case, we have 4 to the negative fifth. To make the negative 5 positive, you know you need to move it to the other side of the fraction bar. So you get 1/4 to the fifth, which is the same thing as 1/4 times itself 5 times, which is 1/1024. This one, again, to make it positive, it's on the top. You need to move it to the bottom and change your sign. 10 squared is the same thing as 10 times 10, which is 1/100. You do this guy on your own. You should have gotten this, which goes to this. Finally, you are free.